I'm not sure if you were here last week or not, but last week was a special week in the life of the experience. And it was special because we did something a little bit different, and we shared what's called a cardboard testimony. There was about several dozen. I'm not sure if anybody actually counted how many people got up. I'm sure I could go to your YouTube site and count everybody as they go across, but I'm sure that there was probably somewhere 30, 40, maybe even 50 people walked across the stage sharing their cardboard testimony. But if you weren't here and you're just, what in the world is a cardboard testimony? Let me explain it to you. First off, you take a big sheet of cardboard, and on one side of it you write down a short word or phrase that describes what your life was like before meeting Jesus, before God. And on the other side of it, you write down what your life is like now that you've met God, now that you know God, now that Jesus has touched your life, and now that He's healed your life. And so on mine, as you can tell, I started out with a bitter heart, and now I have a loving heart. And to give a little bit of background on where I came from, honestly, I have no idea where the bitterness and anger came. It's passed beyond where my memory was. My parents divorced when I was 9, and I grew up predominantly in the life that I can remember in a single-parent home, because right at that point, when I was 9, my mom, sister, and I moved across Canada, and pretty much all through my high school and college life, I struggled with just a deep-seated anger and bitterness. And it wasn't until I moved to Idaho after graduating and found the experience and actually got plugged into a small group that healing began. There's some people who are in that small group here in the room today. It's a DVD-based class called Returning to Marital Intimacy, and it might sound a little strange. Most of you know that I'm married now, but I took this class full of married people as a single person with no significant other on the horizon. This was before Susie had come into my life. And while it just sounds strange to share it, it was exactly where God wanted me, because God was able to start a process of being able to take my bitter heart and recreate it, reform it, renew it into a loving heart. And I don't know about you, there was a bunch of people who shared their cardboard testimonies, but when you are part of a service or when you watch a service like that, there's two different conclusions that you can draw, or two different questions that might pop into your head. The first question, and this is mostly for people who might not have come up and shared, is, what about me? Like, I see all of these people, Jesus has touched their life, but what about me? The other question, and it's possibly what many of the people who got up and shared was, and I kind of have a little bit of this question nagging around in the back of my head, at least on a much bigger scale, is, now what? Like, I know where God had me, or no, where I was before God, and then I know how God has healed me, but now what? And I want to take a few minutes this morning and maybe theorize an answer to the question. And I want to say that the answer is a little bit similar, or a very similar answer could be used for both questions. And the answer is simply stepping out. What you might call it stepping out in faith. I want to say it's stepping out while there's still hope. Because as we see the world around us, there's no shortage of ways that we can just or things that we can see that just make us wonder, why, God? Like, what in the world are you doing? Like, why is all this bad stuff happening around us? Like, we flip on the TV, we see the news, we hear it on the radio. Like, there's no shortage of bad news floating around the internet. And it kind of has this nagging, like, what in the world is going on? Why is, as the world develops technologically, why is it seeming as though, like, our society is just continually going downhill? And really, God, we might ask, when is enough enough? When are you actually finally going to come back? And really, I'm not going to come up here and date set, because that's totally not I have no idea. The Bible specifically says nobody knows the day or the hour, so I'm not going to go there. But I am going to share with you a little bit of a insight that I found in a story in the Old Testament, in an interaction that God has with a man named Abraham that gives us a little bit of a picture about maybe God's perspective on this idea. When does hope actually run out in God's mind? Because each of us may have a different idea of when we've actually lost hope, like when the actual cutoff line is. But has any of us actually thought about what that might be like from God's perspective? And so we're going to turn in our Bibles, or open up your smart devices, your tablets, your iPhones, or any other application that you might have that's the Bible and not Facebook, and look up in Genesis, the first book of the Bible, chapter 18. And we're going to introduce ourselves to a man named Abraham. And while you're flipping to Genesis 18, let me give you a little bit of background on Abraham. Abraham was a man that God called from a distant land to really a distant land for him, but from our perspective here in North America, it's distant land to distant land. But God called him away from his family to move to a distant land to ultimately become the father of the Jewish nation. And Abraham and his wife and his nephew Lot moved across a desert, or around a desert, over to what's now modern day Israel, Palestine, that area, and with the promise of a new life. A lot of stuff happens, and a lot of stuff that we won't cover, but basically Abraham and Lot both independently become very wealthy, and it becomes evident that they actually aren't going to be able to live near each other. Some of us might have extended family members that we can relate to each other, but we just can't live near each other. And this might have been what Abraham and Lot ultimately was. It's like, well, we can get along, but we just can't live in the same neighborhood, or maybe even the same state, or we might need a couple states between us. And so Abraham and Lot decided that they were going to part ways, and Abraham and Lot go up on a hillside and say, okay, well, which area do you want? Because there's plenty of room here. And Lot chooses a valley that's likened to the Garden of Eden and how fertile it is, that has the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah in it. And Abraham stays up in the mountains. And some more stuff happens, and as a prelude into the story that we're going to look at, into this dialogue with God and Abraham, God comes down in the form of a man, and two angels come with him, and they come and meet Abraham, and Abraham invites them in, they eat supper, God promises Abraham a son, but then as they're finishing their meal, they get up to continue walking because God is actually on his way to visit the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so that's where we pick up in verse 18. And then they're walking, and then the other men turned and headed toward Sodom. This is the two angels, but the Lord remained with Abraham. Abraham approached him and said, will you sweep away both the righteous and the wicked? Abraham kind of already knows what's going to go on, because Sodom and Gomorrah had a pretty intense reputation. And looking at outside of biblical sources, like Jewish tradition and some of the other writings that archaeologists have found in that time, we learn a little bit about really actually how bad Sodom and Gomorrah was like. Sodom and Gomorrah was the epitome of a culture that had taken the idea of like insider focused and completely took it to the nth degree. Anybody who was an outsider was worthless, less than nothing, and anybody who was considered poor was even less. It was a society, they lived in a such a lush valley. In several parts of the Bible, it says that it does liken the valley to the Garden of Eden. And in several places, it says that this valley was actually given to the people who lived there as a blessing that they were to use to bless others, but they completely denied that right and instead completely turned inward focused. And if you were an insider, great. And if you were an outsider, then you probably should stay away, because pretty much they crafted all of the laws, everything about the entire culture around the valley of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other towns that were there was crafted in such a way that said, stay out. What's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. And as long as we don't interact with each other, then we can get along. But as soon as you want to interact, then all bets are off. Tradition also has that the reason why God actually came down, and we want to flip to verse 24. Okay, never mind. Go back. I wasn't sure whether it was which verse it's in. God comes down and he says, I've heard an outcry from the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, and I'm not, verse 20? Okay, go back to verse 20 for a moment. It'll take a second. Going back's not as easy as going forward. And God said, basically, I've heard an outcry from the people and I'm going to go down. The Lord told Abraham, I've heard a great outcry from Sodom and Gomorrah because their sin is so flagrant. And 21, I'm going to go down and see if their actions are as wicked as I've heard. If not, I want to know. What could be so bad that it actually reaches God? And Jewish tradition actually gives a little bit of an answer to this, because in Jewish tradition, there's a tale or a story about this beggar who lived in Sodom. And he was an outsider, but for some reason or another, instead of torturing him, what they decided to do was they would give him, they call it an ingot, but basically it's a coin, and they inscribed his name in the coin. And what they would do with this particular type of, ridicule was nobody would sell to them with it. Nobody would give him anything for the coin. It was like money, but it was worthless as far as anybody was concerned. And so he was starving to death. But as time passed, they were kind of expecting, okay, well, maybe he'll just move on, just kind of move on, or maybe he'll just die. But as time passed, neither happened. And the city leaders are bothered by this. What in the world is happening? Until one day they catch, some traditions say one young girl, some traditions say two. And the traditions that say two, one of it was Lot's niece. But essentially, at least one young girl they caught basically smuggling dry, stale loaves of bread to this beggar. And to make an example out of her, and you might want to close your ears because it's a little disturbing, they covered her with honey, strung her up on the city wall, and let the bees eat her alive. And the screams of the bees eating her alive was what Jewish tradition holds actually drew God down to see if the rumors that he possibly couldn't even think were true was actually what happened. And it's pretty crazy. But as we get back to the story of Abraham and his interaction with Lot, we get a little bit of a picture of when God might lose hope. So let's put the verses back up on the screen. Maybe verse 23.